The June 30th ban list is one of the biggest in the history of Standard, with 7 entire cards being banned from the format. This was only being out by the March 2005 ban list, where 8 cards were banned from the format. Considering just how many changes were made, we should probably go ahead and get started. Let's start with 3 cards that were banned from red aggro decks, which were the most dominant deck in the format. Cori-Steel Cutter, Monstrous Rage, and Heartfire Hero were all banned. The Steel Cutter is the main hit here, as the card almost single-handedly made Izzet Prowess the deck to beat at the Pro Tour Final Fantasy. This is an artifact equipment for 1/1 red that has an equip cost of 1/1 red. It gives the equipped creature +1/+1 trample and haste, and it has the Flurry ability. Specifically, whenever you cast your second spell each turn, you create a 1/1 white monk creature token with prowess, which means it gets +1/+1 until end of turn whenever you cast a non-creature spell. And then you can equip the Steel Cutter to it. Essentially, this was a 2-mana spell that, if you had another card to cast after it, instantly put a 2/2 with haste, prowess, and trample into play, and could continue to flood the board with more and more tokens as the turns went on. The deck played a ton of cards like Opt that, for 1 mana, let you replace themselves with another card from your deck. This normally just smooths out your draws, but with cards like Steel Cutter around, it also allowed you to put out a lot of damage. Steel Cutter could easily flood the board with 2 or 3 monks over the course of a couple of turns. Then you could just cast a bunch of cheap spells on 1 turn, and suddenly you can swing for over 10 damage. And all you did was pay 2 mana for an equipment and then play the game normally. The ability to create a ton of prowess monks is already strong, as cards like Monastery Mentor have shown in the past. What makes Steel Cutter so powerful is the fact that it's so difficult to stop. Being an artifact is already a huge upside, as it means that you need far more specific removal to actually answer it. However, only being 2 mana means that it's really easy to cast Steel Cutter on turn 3, then follow up with a 1 mana spell to instantly get your value. At which point, removing the Steel Cutter means that you're still behind on tempo and value. Getting this much tempo and value off of a 2 mana spell was just too much for Standard. Not only could the card pretty much single-handedly facilitate winning the game on turn 4, as long as you didn't completely draw dead, it was even fine if your opponent did have the answer immediately. This meant that you not only had to warp your deck against Steel Cutter to be competitive, but doing so didn't even mean you necessarily beat the Izzet tempo decks. With this in mind, it's pretty easy to see why this card was way too much for the format. Everyone was prepping against it, but they still couldn't prevent top 8 from being overrun by blue-red aggro decks. This ban is the only one that's been done purely for power level purposes, as Cori-Steel Cutter was way too strong. While the other cards banned today are problematic, a big part of why they're being banned is that the decks they facilitate lead to bad gameplay, while Steel Cutter is just straight up format warping. There's virtually no argument against Steel Cutter deserving a ban, so there's not much reason to focus on it. The next 2 bans are hits to mono red aggro, as opposed to the Izzet aggro decks. Monstrous Rage is an instant for 1 red that gives a creature +2/+0 until end of turn, and attaches a monster rule to it. This is a token enchantment aura that gives a creature +1/+1 in trample, but a creature can only have 1 roll aura on at a time. So this gives a creature +3/+1 in trample for a turn, and the +1/+1 in trample sticks around. The other red card that got banned is Heartfire Hero. This is a 1/1 mouse soldier for 1 red. The first time you target with a spell or an ability each turn, you put a +1/+1 counter on it. When it dies, it deals damage equal to its power to each opponent. Now, there's a lot that can be said about these cards, but the bottom line is that they make red aggro too fast. However, more importantly, they both also removed major forms of counterplay that would otherwise allow decks to have a chance against the deck. Monstrous Rage not only let you push through a ton of extra damage, but the trample it gave essentially removed blocking from the game. Red's threats are so efficient that the small boost from Rage is enough for them to beat almost anything in combat, hit for a ton of damage, and then they permanently get a boost to their power and can't be chump blocked for the rest of the game. However, the fact that blocking the creature was all but impossible was made way worse because the creature you were usually targeting was a Heartfire Hero. This would not only make it a 3/3 for the upcoming turns, which would allow it to grow even more over time, but even if your opponent had removal for the hero, they would still end up taking 3 damage thanks to Death Trigger. Generally speaking, when mono red is too good, you have a few options. You either need to play some more cheap blockers like tokens, play some life gain, or play more removal. However, these 2 cards make essentially all of those options irrelevant. Chump blocking is ruined by trample. Removal is made far less effective unless it exiles, and gaining life isn't going to do much if you're getting hit by a 5/5 on turn 3. Considering that these cards not only had allowed mono red to be incredibly powerful ever since they were printed, but that they made it very difficult to build your deck to beat mono red, they were both banned to weaken mono red and allow for more counterplay against the deck. These are two cards that people aren't really going to be sad to see going. There's discussion of if this isn't enough to stop the deck from being so powerful, as Manifold Mouse and Emberheart Challenger alongside the other great pump effects like Turn Inside Out allow this deck to still put up a ton of damage. However, these cards are a lot easier to deal with, in part because they cost 2 mana instead of just 1. This gives players an entire turn to draw more interaction to deal with them. Not to mention that non-exiling removal has more of a chance in the format since they can actually cleanly deal with red threats now. The need to play Temporary Lockdown, which exiles all non-land permanents that cost 2 or less until it leaves the field when it enters, is specifically cited as a part of why these specific changes were made, including hitting Cori-Steel Cutter. It was one of the few cards that could answer a red board without letting hero get its burn damage or leaving behind monk tokens, and allowing all forms of removal to actually cleanly deal with the red threats will let more types of decks be able to counteract any mouse shenanigans in the future. Next up we have Abuelo's Awakening. This is a sorcery for X, 3 and 1 white, with the effect where you return target artifact or non-aura enchantment card from your graveyard to the battlefield. You put X +1/+1 counters on it, and it's a 1/1 spirit creature in addition to its other types. This card was mainly used in a combo deck with Omniscience, a 10 mana enchantment that just lets you cast spells without paying for them. Once you get Omniscience into play, you can kinda just win however you want. By using a ton of powerful draw spells and ways to get access to them multiple times, you can draw your entire deck in one turn and flood the board with more than enough creatures to one-shot your opponent. Even if they have removal, you'll have counter magic, or even just enough gas to win the game over a couple of turns. All you have to do to get this combo online is get Omniscience into the graveyard and get a copy of Awakening, which is made trivially easy with cards like Philology Archaeologist, which mill you and allow you to return an instant or sorcery that you mill to your hand, which can set up either half of the combo, or even both halves if you're lucky enough. Combo decks are always the dangerous thing in a standard format, as they often require very specific interaction to stop. Awakening can only really be shot down by graveyard hate, which very few decks will have in their main board. For many decks, the only way to beat the combo was to simply outrun the Omniscience player, which kind of leads to the same issues as all aggro decks in the format, considering that you either had to be playing a very fast deck or have pretty specific cards to have a reasonable chance of winning against the deck. It's not that surprising that the card was banned. There is some room for discussion as to whether Abuelo's Awakening or Omniscience would have made more sense to ban, as cheating anything besides Omniscience specifically to play with Awakening is far, far worse, and may not be as much of a problem. However, Wizards does know what's coming down the pipeline, and we don't. So it may have been that there were other cards coming out that could also be abused with Awakening, but not more cards that could abuse Omniscience. While we won't be able to say which is the better ban for some time, the absence of this combo will allow for more slow decks to compete in the format. Next, we have 2 cards banned thanks to self-bounce decks: Hopeless Nightmare and This Town Ain't Big Enough. While they have both worked in similar strategies, they actually rarely saw play together, as they functioned in separate versions of the same deck. Hopeless Nightmare is an enchantment for 1 black with the abilities where, when it enters the field, each opponent discards a card and loses 2 life. When it's put into the graveyard from the battlefield, you scry 2, and you can pay 2 and 1 black to sacrifice it. This Town Ain't Big Enough is an instant with a mana cost of 4 and 1 blue. It costs 3 less to cast if it targets at least 1 permanent you control, and it returns up to 2 target non-land permanents to their owner's hand. Both of these cards are combined with various cards that have powerful enter the battlefield effects, or cards that return your cards back to your hand to play them again. Hopeless Nightmare sees play in black-white variants where it's returned to the hand repeatedly with Nurturing Pixie and Sun Pearl Kirin, and then replayed over and over, ripping a card out of your opponent's hand and also doing 2 damage each time. This both allows the deck to strip your opponent of resources while also dealing damage quickly. This is also the cheapest spell to recast several times over the course of the game, as the other ones ask for at least 2 mana, so Nightmare really let the deck play low to the ground. Banning Nightmare gives decks more time to respond to these black self-bounce decks, as well as keep more resources in hand to work with. This Town Ain't Big Enough was played in white-blue variants of the deck primarily, as well as some blue-red decks alongside the best card in the format, Cori-Steel Cutter. This was one of the few self-bounce cards that let you pick up a card while also disrupting your opponent, giving you an extra trigger of any enters effects while also getting rid of the threat from your opponent. Wizards directly points to how the card interacts with Stormchaser's talent, an enchantment which makes a 1/1 token with prowess when it enters, and can level up to gain more abilities at sorcery speed. The second level, which costs 3 and 1 blue to reach, returns any instant or sorcery card from your graveyard to your hand, which can let you pick up a copy of This Town Ain't Big Enough, which can be used to return the talent back to your hand. Then you can replay the town to get another token, and then pay 4 more mana to get your Ain't Big Enough back, and rinse and repeat. The thing about this loop is that, while it isn't that efficient, it means that these cards that are already good enough to play without this interaction can just take over the game if your opponent draws dead for a few turns in a row. These two cards, once you get to around 6 or 7 lands, can effectively lock your opponent out of the game by allowing you to bounce a threat every single turn while also developing their board. This doesn't work with the other self-bounce cards, Sun Pearl Kirin and Nurturing Pixie, as they're both creatures and there's no card like Stormchaser's talent for creatures. They also don't interact with the opponent when you play them, so they wouldn't stop them from developing their board even if there was a loop. The existence of this loop in a strategy that's already more than playable leads to a very bad gameplay, and was yet another strategy you needed specific, efficient removal to deal with. So Wizards decided to ban the card. The final card that was banned was Up the Beanstalk. This is an enchantment for 1 and 1 green with the ability where, when it enters, or you cast a spell with a mana value of 5 or more, you draw a card. This seems to be a cantrip that becomes a draw engine in the late game and a little more, but it's actually very easy to abuse. Any card that technically has a high mana value, but can cost less to cast will trigger Beanstalk even if you don't pay 5 mana for the spell. For example, the Overlords, which can be cast for their cheaper impending costs, but will still trigger Beanstalk to allow the player to draw a card. You don't even need an alternate casting cost. Spells like Leyline Binding, which reduce their cost, also trigger Up the Beanstalk even if you only pay 1 mana to cast them. This made the card extremely powerful in Domain and other top-end heavy decks, and often made it feel like it was impossible to win the late game against these decks. The second Up the Beanstalk entered and the triggered goes onto the stack, you're put into a losing situation. Even if you have removal for the enchantment, you'd still be down a card after you destroy it. So giving up the tempo to play removal and be down a card is a hard sell. However, if you must ignore Up the Beanstalk, then your opponent automatically wins the late game thanks to getting a ton of extra cards. Not to mention, they'll have a way more consistent mid game and have a much easier time finding the answers they need to your game plan to get to that late game. Up the Beanstalk was intended by Wizards to be a fun build around, but they admit in this ban announcement that the puzzle of building around Up the Beanstalk has long since been solved. Any card that triggers Beanstalk, but can be cast for less than 5 mana, is automatically put into consideration for Beanstalk builds, and seeing your opponent play a 2-mana enchantment that lets them draw an extra card for essentially every spell they cast quickly becomes more annoying than interesting. They specifically cite the card causing restrictions in design space for a dimension of its banning, as any card with an alternate casting cost that's less than its main cost, or a cost reduction ability, becomes a nightmare to balance with Beanstalk around. The card's ban is a bit surprising, as it wasn't exactly oppressive at the moment, but it may be that Wizards just wanted to be able to design more cards around these mechanics in the near future, so they decided to axe the card now. Now, before we leave, it's worth mentioning that this is the first early rotation standard banning windows. A banning window that they're using seemingly to shake up the metagame in place of a full-on rotation, so that standard doesn't get stale. Wizards plans to continue these in the future, and it seems that these may be used simply to address annoying, unfun cards that don't necessitate a ban through power alone. This banning has gotten a lot of press thanks to being nearly unprecedented in terms of number of cards banned, but this may simply be the new norm for these specific early rotation banning windows. Considering how many complaints there have been about standard feeling stale and the rotation still isn't going to happen for a while, taking preemptive action every now and then is a good compromise between the stability of a longer 3-year rotation season and the constant new and exciting formats that the smaller 2-year rotation season offered.